Good morning and welcome to Nelson's Mobility Nerd Herb. I'm Mike Nelson and I'm your host. Each month we gather here at the intersection of law, science, and technology to examine the critical and fast evolving world of vehicle mobility. The core of our mission is a fundamental belief that technology powering our vehicles should make our roads safer, not more dangerous. And every year, 40,000 lives are lost on U.S. roadways. That's not just a statistic, that's 40,000 families changed forever. We're here because we believe that number should and can become something of the past. Today, I'm joined by my good friend and longtime collaborator, Dr. Phil Koopman. Phil, you've been a guiding force in this field for years. Could you share a bit about your background and why your work is so influential in this mobility space?
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me on. I've been doing self-driving car safety for just under 30 years. And I started out as just a hardcore techie. And then over time, I've come to realize that to really understand and have an effect in this area, you need to sort of branch out. So along the way, I've picked up some human factors understanding. I've picked up some understanding of the law, a little bit about regulation, all those sorts of things. And I've been involved in the legal side of things as an expert witness, going back to the Toyota unintended acceleration cases more than a decade ago at this point.
Well, you're also an engineer, a PhD. I mean, you tell us a little bit more about your academic background.
Oh, sure. So I teach, well, until recently, I taught at Carnegie Mellon University. I just switched to emeritus, which means I don't teach and they don't pay me, but not retired from life, just retired from the university. But I was teaching embedded systems, and for a bunch of the most recent course has been embedded system safety and security and good code quality, things like this. So I've been heavily involved in the life-critical system design side of things in my research and in my teaching. But I also have a lot of practical industry experience. I stopped counting at like 200 design reviews, and that was a decade ago. So I've got way more dirt under my fingernails than a typical professor does. And I sort of bring that whole perspective across all sorts of industries, not just cars. And I try and bring all that perspective when I talk about safety of self-driving vehicles.
Well, the subject that we're going to be kicking around, and you and I have been doing some of that this week before we even got to this webinar, was the Benavides case, and ultimately the rather large verdict that came down late last week. To everyone tuning in, your questions and insights are vital. Please feel free to place your questions in the chat at any time. We're committed to making this a true conversation, so we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible. No filter, no pre-screening. All are welcome because every perspective helps move this conversation forward. And ultimately, we're here for a serious purpose: to learn, challenge each other, and to come together in a safer environment for safer roads as mobility tech continues to advance. Thanks for joining us and for being part of this important journey. I'm going to go to a very brief summary of the Benavides case. So, and I assume that's why a majority of you have tuned in. So, this accident happened in April of 2019. It was a Tesla Model S, and the vehicle was allegedly in autopilot mode, and it struck a Chevy Tahoe, hit pedestrians, and unfortunately, one of the pedestrians died and the other was seriously injured. The driver of the Tesla, George McGee, admitted distraction while reaching for his phone that apparently dropped to the ground. Now, the plaintiff's allegations are that autopilot was defectively designed and lacked adequate warnings, that Tesla's marketing misled users into over-reliance, and that the claims included strict liability, which is part of the product liability world, for those of you who are not familiar with the law in this area. And there was also a claim for punitive damages. Now, Tesla countered with McGee the driver, not the pedestrians, and this is going to be an important distinction, his distraction was the sole proximate cause, and that autopilot performed as intended and met 2019 industry standards. And the system was not defective and warnings were sufficient. So having said all that, I'm assuming that the verdict of $250,000 is a little bit fuzzy as to what that
Two,
means.
250 million, Mike.
Yeah,
You said
250.
thousand. It's million.
That's my dyslexia kicking in, and
There
that's
we
not
go.
on my
Yeah,
life.
but no, this is a lot. That's a lot of money for sure.
So it is partially the amount of compensable damage, and the jury found McGee to be 66% at fault for the accident. So of the compensable damages, Tesla had to pay 33% of those to the two parties, the one deceased and the representatives of that family, and the injured party. But then hit Tesla with a $200 million punitive damage sanction as well. So when you put all that together, it comes up to be a bucket of money. And I would expect, and I think almost everybody expects, there will be a full-throated appeal of not just the evidentiary issues, but also the award in the end. It'll be interesting to see what the appellate courts do. But one thing I think we can all agree upon is that this verdict is going to shape the discussion on safety and on how legal apportionment of fault is going to fall. And it's worth noting again that these people that received the award were not in the car, they were outside the car, they were not parties to the agreement that Tesla had with McGee or anybody else in the car. So this is an unusual case in that people that are outside the contractual relationship between Tesla and the owner of the car were the ones that were suing. And it also should be noted that McGee himself had already settled out, and we assume his insurance company settled out, but had already settled out some of those claims before they got to trial. So the trial was held in Miami, and the accident happened in Key Largo, not very far down the line of Key Islands. But it took about 3 weeks to complete. And now we'll see what will be post-trial motions coming off of that. But Phil, just having started off with that, do you have any thoughts about the kind of story that a jury would have heard about the type of accident that took place and what kind of controls would have been in place, and your observations about some of the reports coming off the trial?
Let's start with a slight backfill for folks who aren't lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, but Mike is. When you say punitive damages, my understanding, the bar is set really high, that's not something juries can do casually. So could you explain when they, how high was the bar to decide punitive damages? I mean, that's in my layperson understanding, punitive damages, the jury must be really, really upset with Tesla for that to have happened.
Yeah, so in a negligence case, a jury has to decide by a tipping of the scales or a preponderance of the evidence. And if you watch enough criminal cases, you hear beyond a reasonable doubt. These are the standards that we work towards. So in criminal settings, if there's a reasonable doubt, you must acquit.
Yeah, but this was civil, right?
Civil, and you slide in between those two, this tipping of the scales 50-50, and beyond a reasonable doubt, to something called clear and convincing evidence. And we can talk a lot about what is clear and what is convincing, but it's meant to say this is not a yardstick that you would say they're more likely at fault than not. It is so clear that Tesla did something that should be punished.
Right.
And the amount of money that is awarded has to have a relationship to the amount of money that was awarded for the negligence claim, but it's meant to deter this defendant and others from doing similar things.
So this is a jury finding it's not even close. For sure, Tesla acted. Is it? I don't know what the words are in Florida, but reckless disregard is the kind of word you tend to hear. And 200 million is we're sending a message. I mean, that's what I got out of it.
Yeah, you should. And the way you need to look at this is you award punitive damages for criminal conduct or reckless conduct. And
Yeah.
again, we start to draw lines in this of what's negligent conduct, what's reckless conduct, what's criminal conduct. It should be noted that in Florida, it requires a special motion to go to the court and say we're going to pursue punitive damages, and the court has to have a hearing to decide whether or not that type of claim can be honored or should be put to the jury. So the court's acting as a gatekeeper on this.
Okay.
And while we're talking about what the court did, it's also important to note that throughout this trial, Tesla was trying to keep a lot of the evidence that was going to be submitted to the jury under seal and, in essence, not keep it public. And the judge here said, no, not in my court. This is a legal proceeding and we need some sunshine here. Everybody's going to be entitled to see what goes on, see the evidence, and hear the testimony. And that's also another reason why this case is incredibly important. Now, the transcripts have not been released yet. And
So we haven't seen the exhibits in the transcripts, but those are coming. And
that's,
so maybe we'll do another one of these once if we uncover some Easter eggs in there, because
yeah,
neither one of us could be in the courtroom, so we didn't see it. Yeah.
we will absolutely be doing another one of these things if you and I can find the time to do it. I suspect we will. But we'll
Okay.
be comb through the transcript and get the subtleties of the questions that were asked,
Yeah.
see what the witnesses said. We do have some third-hand accounts of all of that. And we can basically get to the storylines each told. So
Okay. Okay. Given that, you asked me a question, but I wanted to backfill because when you find punitive damages, that's a really big deal, right? That means it's not close and somebody did a coin flip. It means that the jury was really, really convinced that there was bad stuff going on.
yeah,
Okay. Based on that, my hot take, and I say hot take because we haven't seen the transcripts, right? But the hot take is that what we've seen going on with all these Tesla cases is that they blame the driver, right? And they also, in the narrative, in the broader narrative as well, the driver knew what they were doing. They signed up, right? And a couple of things that are different about this one is blame the driver didn't work. That all of a sudden, here was a driver who, I was actually, I was a little surprised that Tesla lost on this one because the driver admitted that he'd done something wrong, right? And in the past, we've seen those cases go for Tesla and against the driver. But you have a driver who said, "Yeah, I dropped my cell phone. I was riding around in the floorboards looking for my cell phone when this happened." And yet, the jury said Tesla was a third responsible. That's a huge outcome. Now, my personal opinion is I've been waiting for that outcome because in a sense, all these Tesla drivers are set up to fail due to what we know about human. We can circle back, but there's things called the ironies of automation and automation complacency, which pretty much guarantee people will act that way. It's not a question of moral fiber. It's just that's part of the human condition, right? So the fact that a jury found that even though the driver had succumbed to these weaknesses in human nature, which are fully anticipatable, that they were still going to blame Tesla anyway. So that was huge. And the other thing that's sort of caught up with Tesla is they've been doing all this hype. They've been overstating the capability of their automation. And it's interesting because when you hear them talk to investors and you talk to the public, they're, oh yeah, this stuff. What was one of the things that came out in the trial? If a UFO dropped down in the road, it would see it and stop. And in this case, it did not stop it was a T intersection. And basically this road sort of ended in a T and the car slammed through the T and into the parking area behind, resulting in the fatalities. And so that both of those lines that had been working for Tesla in the past stopped working in this case. So that's super notable.
It's also a person that I know you know well and is well regarded was an expert for plaintiffs. Her formal name is Mary Cummins, but she goes by Missy Cummings. And she was a professor at Duke and now at George Mason and did its stint at NHTSA, or National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. And she said that this system was fundamentally flawed. And the biggest point about the system being fundamentally flawed was this car should never have been used in, I'll call it the roadway, but the operational domain. So, Phil, if you could explain what an ODD is.
Sure. Let me go down that path. And there's some quirks that the way cases work isn't necessarily obvious and intuitive to people who haven't looked at the details. So let me give the slightly more fulsome history, and then you can go back if some of this didn't actually come up at trial. Back after I think it was the Josh Brown fatality. So that was where there was a tractor trailer crossing a road and a Tesla on autopilot underran it. It was a fatality. NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, came out with a report that had a couple recommendations for this technology. And one of them was that the technology is not intended to be used on streets with cross traffic. So loosely limited access highway is the only place supposed to use it. So anything with a traffic light or an intersection, it's not supposed to be used on. So here we had a T. It wasn't just an intersection, it was the road ends. And also they said the driver monitoring based on the steering wheel. So this is an older technology. The crash was in 2019. So it was just torque measurement that it tells you whether you're putting pressure on the steering wheel or not. And they said that was inadequate driver monitoring as implemented back then. I don't know on this model, but back then in that crash, the driver had gone 6 minutes without touching the steering wheel and the car was perfectly happy, waited 6 minutes to remind them, by the way, you're not paying attention. And so they said those two things have to be fixed. Then we later saw a recall from NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, saying those two things were a problem with Teslas. And I think that did come up with trial. And Tesla in the materials, Tesla stipulated, so they agreed without having to argue it in the courtroom that, by the way, we could have fixed that stuff, but we chose not to, is the layperson. So operational design domain, ODD, is when you design these, you have a model of the world, and it's supposed to be safe as long as you're in the model of the world. But if you exclude things like intersections are outside your ODD. But the rub here is this system is happy to let itself be turned on even when it's outside its ODD. You're not supposed to drive on roads with intersections, but yeah, I'll turn on. It's fine. No problem. And then people sort of get seduced into trusting it. Well, it lets itself be turned on. It seems to work. It must be okay. And it's not okay. And we've seen a number of fatalities that sort of pile onto if they had just used their regular navigation maps, not an HD robotaxi map. They just use their regular maps, which have information like, is this a limited access highway or not? And restricted use to only the highways it was intended for, this fatality and a bunch of others would never have happened.
Well, and I'll add to that with some personal experience. So I've had 3 of these vehicles. I had a 2018 Model S, and then I had a Model 3 and a Model Y. And, full self-driving is a term that's been thrown around way too much. But in the full self-driving mode, you can put it on navigation, and then the car is going to take you to your journey's end. Now, I live in a rural part of Pennsylvania. So once you get off a restricted access highway, Route 81, the car will take you off the off-ramp. And then it will put you on a secondary road. And then it'll take you through 2 traffic lights. It'll travel 7 miles on a single lane east direction roadway. And then it'll turn onto my roadway, which is dirt. And it will stay on a dirt road, no lane markings, for 2 miles till it gets to my driveway and then pull in my driveway. So I I never had to do anything special to do it. I just had to simply say that my autopilot I did want to use, or my full self-driving features I did want to use. And it I clicked the button that, or you click the start to make it work. And it never really said, well, we're not on a highway anymore. Do you want to keep going? It just
Well,
kept
and
going.
to be fair, in this particular case, it was autopilot technology, not FSD.
Right.
And FSD doesn't have that same level of disclaimer of a restricted operational design domain. So on autopilot, if you read their owner's manual, listeners should ask themselves if they actually have read their owner's manual. It says there are limitations, but in practice, those limitations are not necessarily all the details you really need to know. So that makes it tricky.
Yeah, my first one was just autopilot, and I could
Yeah.
still use autopilot on a secondary road. It
Right.
wasn't
And
called navigation.
right. Yeah. And one of the catches, well, they also have the older full self-driving was navigate on autopilot was marketed as FSD for a while. So it's all really confusing. And you have a lawyer degree, I have an engineering degree, but not all folks have that degree of rigorous training. And it's pretty much human nature. Ask yourself if you've ever taken a technology you don't know inside out. I've done hundreds of design reviews, so you'd be surprised what I know. I've seen the software of like the thermostat in my house and stuff. But for ordinary folks who don't have that experience, if you turn it on and it decides it's okay to be on, then it's probably supposed to be on. And it's as simple as that. And that was one of the problems with autopilot is you could turn it on in a completely unsafe place. Tesla would say, well, you're supposed to know not to do that. But if it lets you do it, human nature is, it must be okay.
And this sort of segues into a couple other points that Missy Cummings made. She warned that Tesla's marketing language misled drivers into overtrusting the system.
Sure,
Uh, and that, I think, was also consistent with some of the findings of the NTSB going back to some of the other mishaps in Florida and California.
sure.
Uh,
And
and
without being too specific, let me just give one example. Way early in autopilot. So I want to make sure we focus on the autopilot days because things have changed, right? On the early days of autopilot, you had 60 minutes and you had Musk driving the car and he takes his hands off and see, there's no hands. But the manual says your hands have to stay on. And if he had had a crash, he would have been at fault because his hands were off. And so, what kind of message are you sending to drivers who are watching that? One assumes he was trying to sell his vehicle. That's why you would go on 60 Minutes with the demo, right? And it's like, here's the head of the company who understands everything there is to know about it, taking his hands off must be okay. I think that's a reasonable conclusion for a viewer to come to, especially who's not technically sophisticated. And there's a word for that. It's called autonomous washing.
yeah, and I could add some, personal color to this autonomous washing of that 60-minute episode. So
Yeah.
we tried a case against Tesla about a month and a half ago, and we wanted to get to that 60-minute episode. That 60-minute episode, the video, no longer exists. You cannot find it.
Imagine that.
So,
And it's important. It isn't just Tesla who does this. So General Motors had the "We Will Rock You" commercial where the driver was clapping along, and they got such blowback they took that guy down pretty quick, right? So this is an industry. It's not just a Tesla problem; it's an industry problem. But in this case, the fact that Tesla was basically the poster child for this,
yeah,
came home to roost. They came home to roost in this case.
yeah, they were further ahead, but like you've said, there were other. I mean, Hyundai did the auto train, or maybe it was a Genesis, but related to Hyundai,
Yeah.
where stunt drivers are jumping out of sunroofs.
Yeah.
And
Wow. I missed that one. Yeah.
I'll have to send you a clip on that. But
Yeah.
um, the the driver in front is driving in some version of autopilot, but it's dragging along cars that are following that car
Yeah.
identical, and all these other drivers have jumped onto a flatbed truck running alongside this, and
Yeah.
and recently, there's a Jurassic Park commercial where, and this is in my LinkedIn space, where it's a new version of Jurassic Park, but it's touting the new Jeep, and the person in the lab says, "I'm not sure the driver is going to survive, but we're getting great data."
Yeah, people are enjoying making fun of that.
Yeah,
So let me circle back to something I mentioned earlier because I know we want to have time for questions, but something to keep in mind with this technology, there's a couple things. One is all the claims that it improves safety, there's no credible data. There's marketing statements, but there's no credible data. And folks like IIHS, Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, have said these kind of systems where you're supposed to be keeping an eye on what's going on, so-called level 2 plus systems, are a convenience feature, not a safety feature. So anyone who says this improves safety, there is just no credible, transparent, published data source for that. It's all marketing claims. And that's true of every company. That's not a Tesla statement. That's true of every company. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The
and
other
then
is we've
go ahead.
known we've known since the 1940s that people have trouble paying attention to boring things. And we've known since the 1990s that that applies specifically to driving automation. When you automate steering, people drop out. And it's worse than that. People drop out, but also because they're dropped out, their perception reaction time, response time, their ability to respond slows down. They lose situational awareness. And basically asking someone to sit there and watch a system that works really well, that works impressively well almost all the time, and then jump in and stop something when they're about to die is basically asking them all to be superhuman. And then when you hold them responsible in a courtroom for not being superhuman, that's just not a good outcome. I mean, you can say, well, they should have known better. They signed up for the risk. You can say all that stuff, but it's not going to stop the next fatality because asking people to be superhuman doesn't work out. And as you pointed out at the earlier, the thing that's really interesting about this case is the two victims, they didn't sign up. They weren't in the car. So, and
Right.
I think that may have a lot to do with the verdict we saw.
Yeah, and I mean, how are they going to react to get out of the way? We did talk about human
There's no
factors.
way. There's no way they could have got. I mean, they're out there stargazing. They're literally stargazing. You
Yeah.
have an electric vehicle which doesn't make a lot of noise coming at them at above the speed limit. And yeah, the driver acted badly. Everyone admits that, including the driver. But the driver was also put in a position that eventually that kind of crash was going to happen. And if not to that driver, to some other driver, it was
Well,
going to.
let's talk about the human factors part of this. And last time you and I spoke on stage about 2 months ago, we brought this up. There's a 2015 Department of Transportation study that was also written by some OEMs, and NTSB was involved. And it's hard to pin down exactly how long it takes for a human being just to wake up. But it looks, based on the situation, it's somewhere between 1.7 to 2 seconds just to have the, oh crap.
Oh, that's on a good day. So I've recently dug into those numbers.
Yeah.
If you look at the traffic design handbook, it says 2.7 seconds is perception response time. And that's for, I think, 85th percentile. And it doesn't talk about the 99th. And just because you're not as fast as average doesn't mean you should go to jail. I mean, that wasn't on the table here, but that's the kind of way you have to think about this. But if you're, that's for drivers who are in a simulator saying, I'm waiting for the red light. I'm gonna, maybe some of the viewers have done that where you've got, I did that at a state police location once where there's a red light and a green light and you got your foot on the gas and you're just waiting for that sucker, right? And if you can do it in under a second, some people take longer than a second, some people under a second, but that's not, oh, the car has told me it'll, in this case, the driver testified, oh, I trusted the car to take care of me because everyone said it would do the right thing. So I just wasn't as uptight. And you see numbers up to 10 seconds, 25 seconds, depending how complicated the environment, 40 seconds, depending how complicated the environment is. And so the automation complacency is you're used to this thing driving excellently for mile after mile after mile after mile. You're not going to be below 1 second responding when all heck breaks loose. It's gonna take you a while to go, what was that? What's going on? I don't, and then it's too late. That's the
Yeah.
problem.
Because there's
And
these three.
that's not lack of that's not lack of moral fiber because you didn't pay attention. It's called being human. That's what people do.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that scene in when Tom Hanks is the pilot in the plane that lands on the Hudson,
Yeah.
and they said you had time to get back to the airport. He goes, no, I needed time to be a human,
Yeah.
and okay, give
And
me.
and and if you know what's happening, it's easy to say you should have done this, but in the moment, it takes a while to what's going on.
Right, that if you're Captain Sully and everybody thinks he's a great pilot, and he still can't be anything but a human being first.
Yep.
So,
That's
and
just the way it is.
that 2 seconds is just to wake up and realize something's going on. Then you have
The
to
2.7 is you're following a car and he jams on his brakes.
right, and then you have to come up with a plan, which may not be the right plan.
Well, if he jams on his brakes, you're playing his brakes. That's why that's the best case. That's not a typical case. That's sort of the best. That's why they say to leave 2 or 3 seconds to the car in front of you, but that's a best case scenario.
Right.
So something unusual takes longer to process, and that's just the way it is.
Well, the other point that Missy Cummings made was, the um, Tesla failed to anticipate the predictable misuse of the vehicle.
Yeah.
And that also was mentioned in some of the government studies um, in previous Tesla incidences. And predictable misuse is a concept that's recognized in product liability law. So if the product can be misused, and you didn't warn of that, or you didn't take safeguards to make sure predictable misuse wasn't accountable for, you can be held strictly liable. So maybe if you can just slide into that concept of predictable misuse, I think you started to get there. But
Sure.
you know,
Sure. There's the issue that if you have a product that can be dangerous, people will misuse it, especially if they have an incentive to do so. And so years ago when I was a kid, I'd be impressed if anyone else remembers this, but there was a self-propelled vacuum cleaner, and the commercial made fun of it that it required pressure on the handle. So there were all these commercials about people using the vacuum cleaner who would push it across the floor and then give it a scooting motion. Come on, keep going. I want to sit down and watch you vacuum. And it's like, no, no, no. You have to have hand on it. Well, so that's predictable misuse, is somebody trying to say, I have a self-propelled vacuum cleaner. But that was several decades before Roombas were a thing, right? And so now you have a car, and if the car lets you play with your cell phone while you're driving it, people are incentivized to do that. And they've been told it drives safer than they do. So there's no harm in look at your cell phone. And the next thing you know, it's been a minute since you looked up at the road. And that's how people are wired. And you could say, well, you shouldn't do that. And it's true, you should not do that. But sending that person to jail or finding them out of existence or whatever is not going to stop the next person to do it, because you're trying to deny human nature. So predictable misuse. So there's intentional abuse. I get that somebody can maliciously go in and rewire stuff and do all sorts of crazy stuff. And that's a harder problem. But people acting as people act is a thing. And when you put out a product, you may not realize it, but after several hundred YouTube videos of people misusing this technology, you ought to sort of get the message, you got a problem. And the issue here was that driver monitoring. The driver monitoring allowed the system to be used when the drivers were misusing it in an extremely predictable way.
well, this many people that will point to the fact that Tesla's accumulating miles and wants to accumulate a
Well,
wide variety of miles.
well, good for them, but they shouldn't put the public in danger while they're doing it, right?
But I wanted to ask you, why the push to accumulate miles? Why is
Well,
it important for that?
well, the story, it depends who you ask. If you ask the regulators, it was just a level 2 driver assistance system. But if you ask the stockholders and the public and everything else you hear from Tesla, they were accumulating data to build a robotaxi. And so that way they could use retail customers who would pay for the privilege of operating a vehicle to collect data for Tesla. That's been the corporate narrative for a decade or more.
And then,
How many anniversaries of Tesla promising robotaxi next year are we at? And sure enough, they have one out on the streets in Austin this year, but it was a long time coming for sure.
yeah, Alan Moore was also an engineer on behalf of the plaintiffs, and I'm not familiar with his work at all, but I'm interested to read what his testimony was when we went in front of the jury. But one of the things that surfaced, and this was surprising, is that Tesla apparently had deleted some data and then said they didn't have it. And then apparently this expert went to the remains of the car, harvested out of one of the units. I imagine it was the self-drive control.
Yeah, I've participated in these exercises. Yeah,
Yeah, and they're hard. We have two. It's
it's tough.
an
So,
amazing.
so
And
let me explain how that could, let me explain sort of how all that works. When there is a crash and the vehicle survives the crash, well, the equipment's not burned down by a fire or something like that, which in this case, the vehicle survived the crash. If there's a crash, it phones home after the crash and sends home some of the data, operating data. And there's a ton of data. There's a lot of data. You get this big, and I know, Mike, you've seen these too, because you work with them. You get this big spreadsheet down to, all right, the autopilot was on, autopilot was off, the driver moved the steering wheel, the brakes were on, all these kind of crash sensor, all these kind of things in that data. And that data gets sent via by cell phone data link up to Tesla, and they keep it on their servers. And it's really common in these cases for the plaintiffs to get hold of that spreadsheet and do some analysis on the data, which I know you work on. But there's a second place you can get the data, and there's a SD card, but we used to call it digital camera film back when digital cameras were still a thing, right? And it's a little tiny SD card that is inside the main computer. It's not an SD card the occupant has access to. You have to go behind the dashboard to get it. But you can pull out this SD card, and it has the full set of data. Only some of that's transmitted back, and it can go back to the day the car was purchased if it hasn't run out of room. And you can do some analysis on that. It's a proprietary format. It's super painful to extract that data, but you certainly can do it. And in fact, NTSB in some of their crash reports based those crash reports on having collaborated with, I think it was the the Dutch version of NTSB had created some tools to extract that data. And so in this case, the clients must have pulled out the data from the SD card and use those tools, because back in that era, the tools would have worked. Those tools decay pretty quickly. It's hard to keep them running, but those tools would have worked. So they must have pulled out the SD card data to get that data.
Yeah, and then
So for anyone in the audience, if you have a Tesla crash that is a big deal, make sure nobody touches the computer and make sure you get forensic chain of custody on that SD card inside your computer, because that's your backup in case Tesla mysteriously loses your data.
yeah, and then just to make it even more easy to follow, your insurance company most likely is going to total loss this car.
Yeah.
You want to say to your insurance company, I want this car put on hold until we figure out what happened.
Right. Because you don't want it disappeared and then you can't get the data.
Yeah. And I've had these situations where an insurance company sold the salvage in a fatality, and somebody said, "Where'd that car go?" And parts were strewn all over North America.
You have to make sure you don't lose control of that car. That's super important in a high severity crash that you may need the data later.
Well, so let's talk about Tesla's experts, and I'm familiar with both of them. I've litigated against both of them. So they're accident reconstructions, a gentleman by the name James Walker, really good witness. And then they brought in a human factors expert, and his name is I'm just going through my notes here. I'll get to him after I get done with James Walker. But what these experts did was they sort of took this weird position. This crash was not preventable by any vehicle system in 2019. And I know this is going to get you charged up a bit, Phil, but autopilot performed as expected.
Man, how many terms? So there's two things you hear in these cases. One is performed as expected, and the other one is conform to all required standards. So let me go there. And I'm not going to try and dissect the gnarly details here, but it's very simple. There are no standards that deal with automated driving. Those standards don't exist. So the standards you have to conform to are federal motor vehicle safety standards, and those have to do with whether the tire pressure warning light works and whether your airbags work. None of them have anything to do with with lane centering or any autopilot-like stuff. So conforms to standards, all applicable standards, of which there are none. They left that part off the sentence. And the other one is works as designed. Well, you can have a system that is horribly dangerous that works exactly in the horribly dangerous way you intended it to work, and that doesn't mean it's safe. So it's a useful statement to say, well, there's no software bugs that we know of. Okay, that's fair, but it begs the question of, well, but if your human computer interaction model was flawed, working exactly as intended according to a flawed model still results in a product that presents unreasonable risk. That's where we come out.
And I at bottom, and this is when I started to see them go there, and I'm not sure they had much of a choice, but they're blaming.
I don't think they had a choice. That's their playbook. But and
They,
and their
they
lawyers did what they're paid to do, and that's part of the process. That's okay. But you have to be very critical when you hear some of these talking points. You have to really engage your critical thinking to realize, what's the smoke they're blowing and what part of the sentence did they leave out.
Yeah, but the irony here is, and this is why it's an interesting claim to have litigated, the people that were harmed weren't the ones that were supposed to do something.
Yeah.
They tried to blame the driver.
Yeah.
And, that obviously worked. The jury said 60%, 66% responsibility was the driver's.
And the driver admitted that they weren't doing what they should do. But if you put a driver in a no-win situation and blame them for not winning, legally you might be able to do that, but it doesn't mean that the manufacturer should get 100% off the hook. And that's what we saw happen. That the manufacturer is like, well, come on, you built a system that was hard to be safe in, and yeah, the driver should have done better, but you don't get off scot-free on this.
Yeah, and I think it sort of begs the question when you say that the driver should have done better, or it was all the driver's fault, then you have to absolve yourself 100% to make that work. Because if it's all his fault and none of your fault, then how do you do that with emerging technology that arguably you've overused, introduced, and
You've oversold, you've overhyped. It clearly violates pretty well-established human-computer interaction principles, right? And really, what we saw historically was back in the Josh Brown, it was 6 minutes between nags. And what we saw historically was Tesla was sort of, well, they'd reduce it a little, but then we saw a fatality that was less than 10 seconds after engagement. There was a fatality. So we knew that this was a system that could have been, and Tesla admitted in this case, it could have been designed to be safer, and they chose not to. But you know what? Let's set aside the legal stuff and let me put on my safety advocate hat for a moment. When you see a crash like this, it's important to talk about blame because that's the legal process. It's a civil case. You talk about blame. I get that. But what I care about the most for safety is how do we stop it from happening the next time? And blaming the driver does not stop it from happening the next time. So whether or not you think Tesla was ill-behaved, which the jury clearly did because they did punitive damages, even setting that aside, going forward, the big question is how do you keep that from happening the next time? And better driver monitoring and more rigorous ODD enforcement are the two things that we've known for years and years and years should have been done. And I hope even now, I think there's more room to improve on those when you're using autopilot rather than FSD. And by the way, they apply to all the other companies, but the other companies who have the advanced automation, not just lane centering, but the things that are like, now this is sort of a robotaxi-ish light experience, like the Blue Cruise and the Super Cruise. Those guys do enforce ODD, and they do have camera-based driver monitoring. So we saw the rest of the industry sort of got the memo from that NTSB investigation and acted on it, but what we saw Tesla did not.
Yeah, and I think that the driver monitoring system also is something that there were two camps. It was hands on wheel.
Mhm.
We've talked about some of the problems on that. And the other is in cabin camera monitoring attentiveness.
Mhm.
Uh, it seems Tesla quietly has gone into in-camera monitoring, and that
They've
can
been sliding sort of that way. Although before you give them full credit, ask if there's infrared illumination because otherwise it probably doesn't work at night. So there's a lot of hype going on there. But an in-camera monitor that actually can see your face, not over to one side, but in front of you, that has infrared illumination is the gold standard. And the rest of the industry has been there for years. That's what you want to see.
it does work rather well. I was in my Rivian this weekend driving back and forth from New York,
Yeah.
and um, if I just happened to glance at the radio station,
Yeah.
it give me a warning saying
Well,
pay attention.
and
Uh,
people hate the nag, but the other thing we know, there were some studies about this that people think they're paying more attention than they are, and people think that they're safer than they are, and so there's that. We're back to human nature again.
well, how about we invite Tracy in to see if we have any questions from the audience? Tracy, do you have anything you can share with us?
I do. Yeah, we had a lot of questions come in. So if we don't have time to get to them all today, and you did leave your name with your question, we will get back to you. But let's start it off here with one of our first questions that came in. We know that ongoing Tesla investigations by NHTSA were mentioned by experts. Do you think the general animus towards Musk prevented crashes, affected the jury?
Do we think, just clarify the last part. Do
Oh,
we,
sure. Do you think just the I guess general attitude towards Musk and previous crashes affected the jury's verdict?
boy, it's hard to climb inside the mind of the jury. I mean, um, I'll just give you my impression of the jury, but these are huge numbers. More, the punitive damage number is a big number. The compensable damages, knowing that the parties that were already injured had received a substantial amount of money, they didn't know how much, but to value a life or to value these injuries in the tens of millions of dollars um, is nowadays it seems to happen more and more, but these would easily qualify for what lawyers call nuclear verdicts. And so you usually find that when the jury is frustrated, angry with the other party in the litigation. They're almost, in a way, adding their own punitive damages before they get to punitive damages. So, do I think some of this is about Musk? Absolutely. And I also would say, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Phil. He has so much identified himself as the party who launched this platform and is bringing it to fruition. So he's made it very much about him, even though there are plenty of people in that company.
So my understanding is the jurors got asked about this and they screened out jurors who were particularly anti-Musk. But Mike, you're the lawyer. I'm not going there. I watched enough seasons of Bull to know that jury selection is a thing, right? I'm not going to go past that. But one thing I will bring up is I believe they were not allowed to talk about the NTSB result with
Or
this,
not.
but they were allowed to talk about the recall. So NHTSA had a recall. So recall is the process. So the over the update is the remedy. The recall is the administration process. There's an administration process where Tesla said, "Well, we don't admit it, but we're going to do it anyway." And Tesla had said, NHTSA had said, we found time after time that there's these problems with autopilot, and we want you to improve driver monitoring, improve ODD enforcement. And Tesla said, well, we don't agree, but we're going to make the changes just to get this done with, where they sort of improved ODD enforcement a little bit and they sort of improved driver monitoring a little bit. But that, I have to imagine the jury heard, oh, there was a safety recall for exactly the things that the plaintiffs are saying were wrong with the car. That's got to weigh in on the jury, I would think.
Yeah, so the NTSB, just to clarify that part of it, the NTSB is the National Transportation Safety Board, and they investigate all kinds of accidents and pipeline fire failures and train accidents.
Air crashes in particular. Yeah.
And their reports are not admissible, and they're
Yeah.
not a government agency. They're an investigative force. NHTSA is the regulator here, and NHTSA is charged with making sure one, products comply or at least have standards that can be complied with, and that they also are allowed to do product defect investigations. And
So we haven't seen the transcript, but if I'm the plaintiff attorney, I'm going to say, look, even NHTSA said there were safety defects on these two areas we're arguing, and that would be legitimately backed up by that recall.
Tracy, just if we can move to a couple more questions, that'd be great.
Of course. So we had another question that came in and that said, is it important to focus on product liability versus tort in lawsuits like this? And if so, why? The context of my question is I'm wondering how, as an engineer, I should view liability for autonomous systems.
Well, Phil, that sounds like that makes more.
You're gonna love the new book that's coming out in a month because it talks about all this stuff. But let me give the brief overview. So I have a book on embodied AI safety coming out, and that's one of the themes. The overview is, in the past, product liability was, and Mike, you can jump in if I get the law wrong, because I'm not the lawyer. I have law journal papers, but not because I'm a lawyer. That product liability is supposed to make it easier because you don't have to prove malicious intent or negligence on the part of the manufacturer. It's like, if it's broken, and we don't care how it got here. If you can prove it's broken, you win on product liability. And that was great for mechanical systems, but it really has shown sign of wear for computer-based systems where, I've done the thing where you go in and look at hundreds of thousands of lines of source code and find the one true bug, and it's really expensive. It's really hard. It's impractical for a single fatality case. There's, someone's got to come up with a couple $1 million to make that happen. And believe me, I'm not getting all that money. It's just a really expensive process. Okay. And so I think when we go to automation, autonomous systems, robotaxis, we're going to have to see a switch back to tort law, where their behavior is held to be, well, you have to be no worse than a human driver on a case-by-case basis, because nobody can afford the analysis. I mean, you have a Tesla, the FSD is an end-to-end machine learning, ginormous machine learning. And if you want to prove a product defect and you don't get lucky on the circumstances, it's like, so show me which transformer multiplicative weight was the one that caused the crash. And maybe because someone could figure out how to do that, but if somebody asked me to do it tomorrow, I wouldn't know how to do that, right? You're not gonna be able to afford. You're not gonna win the product liability cases. So I think we're gonna have to see a shift back to tort law for autonomous systems as a matter of practicality.
So here's a little bit of a. I'm going to do some tightening around some of those concepts. Product liability and negligence are both considered tort law, but product liability is its own unique animal, and it actually is a little bit about the concept of economics. So who should bear the brunt of a product that hurts people? That's really where the concepts come from. And who's in a better position? Society or the manufacturers making the product? And it incentivizes manufacturers to make safer products or warn when they can't be made safer. But you can still simultaneously be sued for negligence in addition to product liability. So I'm not sure if we say, well, we're going to treat it as tort law only, or negligence law. That's the be all and end all. I've been saying for well over a decade now on this topic, technology has raced ahead of the legal system again. And when I say the word again, I'm talking about centuries, because it just does. We don't recognize the legal problems, but now we're running into a situation where technology is advancing so quickly, it's going to be even harder to build a legal system that adequately embraces what it needs to deal with these problems. Doesn't mean we should stop.
Yeah. But
means we should get busy building this new system. And there's some work being done on this, but not nearly enough. From the standpoint of product liability law, it's actually harder to defend yourself. And from the standpoint of negligence, you get into much more of the subjective elements of what happened in an accident. It's important to note here, though, this was product liability. And the jury found that they had, basically broken the product liability standards.
Yeah, I think the important thing from product liability is this was not a reverse engineering of the source code, but rather based on the human computer interface, which is much different than the show me the buggy line of code, right? Nobody alleged that the code was defective. They just said that the human interface was designed to set up the driver. So that's an interesting twist. Also for the negligence, the proposal that I co-authored with Bill Wyden, who's at Miami Law, has been that we should hold the computer driver to the same standard as a human driver in the same crash, and the manufacturer should be the responsible party. If you make those two changes to current negligence laws, then you don't have to write a whole new set of law. I think it should be layered. I think there should be negligence as a first layer for the easy cases. I mean, hey, the robotaxi ran a red light and killed someone. Why are we looking for source code defects, right? It ran a red light. We're done. And then in cases where negligence doesn't really cut it, then product liability should still be there, but it should be the secondary defense, not the primary thing doing the heavy lifting.
Tracy, maybe one last question.
Okay, sure. I'll pick this one. I think this one might be a shorter answer, but we'll see. Could OEMs get away from legal responsibility in a road crash by intentionally forcing the buyer of a level 2+ vehicle to sign off at the time of buying, such that the OEM won't be blamed?
Short answer, no. In other words, you can't say, I accept under contract that you can breach a product liability standard and you can't hold me harmless for that. So no, but you can acknowledge that you were given warnings. Warnings are an insulation of sorts against a product liability claim, which is why when you go to open up a bottle of or a box of tissue, there's 15 different warnings about how dangerous tissue can be. But no, you cannot insulate yourself completely from these kinds of scenarios by simply saying, and they've tried it, Tesla. If you go through, they will come up with every scenario imaginable and say, by the way, this car may become radioactive, and you should use it at your own risk. I'm being facetious here.
Do the wrong thing at the worst time? Is that the one?
Yeah. So listen, they're in a tough space in some ways, and I'm not without some sympathies. They are trying to advance the cause.
And it's true that everyone loves to sue car companies. I get that, right? That's, car companies get sued. That's what happens. But the issue I see in a lot of these cases is that the car company, in some cases, then there's no merit and the car company wins, and that's fine. But in some cases, what you see is the car companies really cutting corners on safety because they have to get to market because they're worried about cost, and they cut them a little more than they really should, and trying to suss out where that dividing line is how you get these cases.
And the marketplace dynamics, and I'm going to end with this, the marketplace dynamics are harder than they've ever been. The traditional OEMs are trying to compete with Tesla. Tesla went so far ahead of their competition of the traditional auto marketplace. But Tesla's in reality competing with the Chinese manufacturing platforms. And Tesla's far behind companies like BYD. We may not see BYD cars here for a foreseeable future, but we're seeing the effects of that. And so Tesla's, while it's done wonderfully, is in a fight for its life. So you're going to see them try to do things like robo-taxis quickly, not just because sales are down, but because they have to get out to the lead position. They're not there right now. We're going to close now. If you'd like to discuss this case further, feel free to schedule some time on my website. I'm sure Phil would be happy to talk with you as well. Based on the comments that have been passed around, this is a very polarizing subject, but the one thing I think we can all rally around is the need for safer roads for ourselves, our families, and the public at large. And mobility tech holds such promise to support these goals if it's introduced properly and engineered with rigor and objectively evaluated. Those are tall orders for the car manufacturers and the tech goes in them. But it's very important that we as a society make those moves as well, because somehow we're still losing 40,000 people a year, and that has to stop. Phil, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure to do this with you. I'm sure
Thanks
we could
for having me on.
I'm sure we could talk about this for years. I'm sure we will be talking about this for years. And thank you for everybody participating. And to all the folks on my team, thank you very much.